We are in Parshat Naso, which has our tradition's oldest blessing within it, Birkat Kohanim, also known as the priestly benediction, so named because only priests in ancient times could utter this blessing over the people. And in traditional synagogues today, it is still only recited by Kohanim, people with names like Cohen and Katz, which is the acronym for Cohen Tzaddik, people who were Jewish descendants of those priests of over 2,000 years ago. But does Judaism believe that the power to bless and lead resides only in the hands of an inherited elite? There's an earlier Exodus text which seems to contradict this notion, in which God exhorts, "You shall be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." This democratization of leadership became fully realized after the temple was destroyed, and we moved from our leaders being priests, who had the title by virtue of their fathers and grandfathers being priests, to rabbis, who earned their leadership by virtue of their learning and wisdom. Now anyone could be a leader. We could all be a kingdom of priests. Except that for most of Jewish history, that kingdom was only for men. A dramatic turning point in this story of Jewish leadership happened on this very day, 50 years ago, June 3rd, 1972. Sally Priesand walked across the podium of Plum Street Synagogue in Cincinnati. HUC President Rabbi Alfred Gottschalk rested his hands on her shoulders and whispered timeless words of transmission before the open ark. Priesand walked off the bima, a rabbi, the first woman ordained by a major seminary in all of Jewish history. The ordination of Rabbi Sally Priesand changed Jewish leadership forever. And she was connected to a wider movement that was afoot for women's rights and access. Only 20 days after her ordination, on June 23rd, 1972, Congress passed Title IX, which demanded equal resources and access for women in education and athletics. When I was born in Korea, halfway around the world, in July 1972, I had no idea these watershed moments, which occurred just weeks before my birth, would radically alter the opportunities for my life. I feel grateful today to be marking these 50 years. The 50th year in Judaism is called the Yovel, or Jubilee, which Rabbi Lords just mentioned. And the Jubilee year is always about liberation. Tomorrow night is also the 50th day after Passover, which we've counted the 49 days of the Omer to get us to Shavuot, tomorrow night, which is all about revelation. So 50 is our tradition's number for liberation and revelation. And sometimes we need anniversaries, like a 50, to take a step back and appreciate how far we have come. Because for better or worse, each generation takes their reality for granted and often doesn't appreciate how different things were just moments before. I'm embarrassed to say that when I got to college in 1990 and my roommate got involved in the Women's Center, I thought to myself, why do we even need a women's center anymore? We're all equal. The job of feminism is done. It was only many years later that I appreciated that Yale had only gone co-ed in 1969, and not because President Kingman Brewster believed in fairness or equity for women, but based on his concern that they couldn't attract the best men without, quote, coeducational attractions. Women were an amenity that the school could no longer do without. Now, initially, the school was committed to a 7-to-1 male-female ratio. It was only because of Title IX and the government's insistence on equal access that Yale got rid of that gender quota over the next 7 years. When I arrived in 1990, Yale had just barely reached gender parity in the student body after the school's nearly 3 centuries of existence. and 90% of the tenured faculty was still male. My God, was I oblivious. But I learned not only how much protest and sweat enabled the reality that I was living in, but of course, how much work there still is to do. When I arrived at HUC in 1995, mine was the very first class of rabbinical students with an equal number of male and female students. I went to school at a time of burgeoning feminist awareness with a women's Torah commentary that lifted up women's stories in the Bible and featured female scholars. I led women's seders and had female professors at HUC. My rabbinic mentors were all male, but they gave me a chance to lead and championed me. It was because of these mentors, like Rabbi Peter Rubenstein, and the shoulders of the many women on whom I stood, that I could dream of a position like this at Central Synagogue. At the time when I applied for this position, you could count on one hand the number of women in the country who led a large congregation. That has definitely changed in the last 8 years. Now I need all my fingers and even a few of my toes. But in addition to seeing women lead congregations, having women in the Rabbinate has transformed intangible things like our spirituality and even our theology, even our assumptions about Jewish authority. I used to often hear, kind of sheepishly, people would say, "You know, Rabbi, I think Rabbi Jack Stern is the voice of God." I couldn't argue with that. Rabbis who are tasked as messengers of God's teachings, not surprisingly, shaped people's views of God himself. And I do say himself intentionally. But interestingly, when women became rabbis, I never once heard, "Rabbi Sally Priesand is the voice of God." When women became rabbis, people didn't switch to thinking that God's voice was female. They just stopped thinking that rabbis were the voice of God. Now, I wouldn't take that, now it would take a whole sermon to unpack that, but I'm going to pass that up for now. But I don't actually think that's a bad thing. I don't think that that's about disrespect. On the contrary, I think women helped us all understand and conveyed and believe that the voice of God can be heard in every one of us. That's the message I hear when God says in Exodus, "You shall be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." It's a charge for all of us to speak and walk in God's ways. I look at the Jewish community today, and we know it's not just priests who lead, it's not just rabbis who lead. Truly, the responsibility is on all of us. Tonight, I feel very honored to be installing the trustees and officers of this sacred congregation. Leaders who partner with our clergy and our staff to guide and push and support and lift up this congregation, who represent the very best of us and bring diverse viewpoints and experiences, their seichel, their compassion, and their wisdom. We are so grateful for their service to this community and to the Jewish people. I'd like to invite them up in a few moments. I'll name them all and install them. But then I want you, the entire congregation among our kingdom of priests, to bless them with the very words found in our Torah portion tonight, the priestly benediction, the one that used to be only the domain of a few elite priests. But tonight, we will embody the vision that we are a large and loving kingdom of leaders, a holy congregation with the authority, the inheritance, and the privilege to offer blessing to.